What I'd like to talk about today is the understanding of the relationship between multifidus and multifidus dysfunction in people with low back pain and how that might be relevant for recovery. So it's really well understood that there are structural and functional changes in the back muscles, particularly the multifidus muscle, in people with back pain. What I'd like to do is to try to address several questions. The first is to consider, does control of the lumbar spine and pelvis depend on muscle? Secondly, how does the muscle dysfunction present in back pain? What are the mechanisms for this muscle dysfunction? Is back muscle dysfunction relevant for spinal health? And then finally, does back muscle dysfunction have implications for injury and pain, rehabilitation, and recovery? So first of all, does control of the lumbar spine depend on muscle? And it's been well known for many years that the spine is inherently unstable. Because it's unstable, we need muscle. And the first thing to know is that all muscles are important. But there does seem to be some specific importance of muscles that have segmental attachment. So muscles like the multifidus that attach to individual segments of the spine. So if we think about the spine as an unstable block, we have these long muscles which are able to keep the spine upright, the muscles like the erector spinae that produce forces that move us. But we also need to have these small segmental muscles that attach to each individual lumbar segment. And it's been known since Lucas and Bresler's work years ago that if you have one segment with no muscle attachment, the spine is as stable as having no muscle at all. So critical to control of the spine is this intersegmental attachment. So how does back muscle dysfunction present in back pain? And there's been a phenomenal amount of research that suggests that there is changes in back muscle in terms of its structure and function. And this is particularly the multifidus, but again, it's not only the multifidus, but most prevalent changes and the most common changes are in that muscle. So there's atrophy, there's fatty infiltration, there's recent evidence of connective tissue changes such as fibrosis, there are muscle fiber changes, and there's delayed and reduced activation. So all of these features are going to compromise the capacity of the multifidus muscle to provide control to the spine. So what are the mechanisms to explain the dysfunctions that occur in the multifidus muscle and the other back muscles? And the changes that occur in the muscle could be contributed to by features throughout the nervous system. It could be changes in the cortex, changes in spinal cord and deep brain mechanisms. It could be changes added in the periphery and muscle. And our research has been showing that it is changes across this spectrum of different parts of the motor pathway that are involved. And there are different mechanisms that require different considerations for intervention. So if we think first down at the distal end, so down at the muscle, muscle is obviously critical. Muscle is the end organ of the motor system. It regulates tissue loading, and if you compromise the capacity of muscle, you compromise the capacity of that muscle to regulate the loading on the tissues. And if there's suboptimal loading, that may contribute to ongoing nociceptive inflammation, so these threat signals that are being relayed into the nervous system that contribute to the experience of pain. So we've known for many years that the multifidus muscle tends to atrophy very quickly in an acute phase of low back pain. So that's been shown in humans, and in animal experiments, we've shown that if you injure an intervertebral disc, you get atrophy of around 20% of the multifidus muscle size at the level immediately below the injury that occurs within 3 days. And we've shown in other experiments using electrical stimulation paradigms that this is related to inhibition primarily at the spinal cord. So in the early phase, the acute phase, we see this phase of inhibition of the multifidus muscle, so reflex inhibition type mechanism. And what this means for intervention is that we need to have some exercise intervention or some strategy to activate the muscle to overcome this inhibition and to restore the muscle. In the subacute phase, we see something different. The cross-sectional area of the whole muscle tends to recover in that subacute period. But what's been shown in many studies, including human studies and work that we've done in animals, is that there is a change in the composition of muscle. There is a change in the muscle fiber types to have less of the slow twitch fibers, those slow muscle fibers that are important for ongoing low-level tonic control of the spine. There's an increase in the connective tissue, so fibrosis, and an increase in the fat. And in this subacute phase, what we've also observed is that this tends to be mediated by a pro-inflammatory process. So the muscle starts to undergo an inflammatory process that increases the collagen synthesis, that increases the adipose deposition. So cytokines such as the interleukin 1 beta, TNF, have been shown to be involved. So what we seem to see is this muscle inflammatory process that begins in the subacute period that starts to change the structure of muscle. So the question is, if it's an inflammatory process, can we reverse that with exercise? And we know, of course, that anti-inflammatory drugs are one possibility for having anti-inflammatory effects, but exercise also has potential anti-inflammatory mechanisms. So we've done a series of studies looking at whether activation of muscle and exercise can have an effect on reducing the changes in the inflammatory process. So for these experiments, we've used a type of mouse that develops a spontaneous intervertebral disc injury. We've had one group of mice that have been sedentary, and we've had another group of mice who've undertaken physical activity. And what we showed, and that's just by running in an exercise wheel, and what we've shown is that the discs that spontaneously degenerate, the multifidus muscle that's associated with that disc tends to have an increase in connective tissue. So the fibrous coating around the muscle increases, and there is also an increase in the inflammatory response in that muscle. But if the mice exercise, those changes are reduced. So physical activity can attenuate the connective tissue fibrosis change and the inflammatory change within the muscle, but not completely. So what we can see is in the subacute phase, this pro-inflammatory phase, exercise can have an impact. We've so far tested general exercise, and it does reduce the effect, but it doesn't completely remove it. And our hypothesis is that more specific activation to make sure that we drive the muscles involved, we may be able to more completely impact these changes. So do these inflammatory responses also occur in humans? All of that data comes from animals, and some recent work that we've done with tissue that's been harvested at the time of surgery suggests that a similar inflammatory process is occurring in human muscle. And then if we move to the chronic phase, so in this phase we have this massive replication or a massive introduction of adipose into the muscle. There is a complete loss of the structure of the multifidus muscle in many people. And what we have is this chronic disuse or deconditioning phase. And this is really going into the component where you really have the major structural muscle dysfunction because of disuse. And in this case, exercise again is going to be important, but a critical aspect is we need to make sure that the muscle that is problematic is engaged. And if we simply do back extension exercises, we're not necessarily going to be engaging the multifidus muscle. So we need to make sure that we change the pattern first and then add the load to have the impact on muscle hypertrophy. We can do that with exercise, maybe stimulation is another possibility. So what we can see is that the changes that occur in muscle depend on the particular phase of the situation that a person is in with their back pain, and the type of exercise will depend on the different mechanisms. But it all involves engaging muscle, doing exercise, maybe different types of exercise at different phases. We've also done work at many other levels of the nervous system, from the spinal cord up to the cortex, and we don't have time to talk about it today, but we've shown massive reorganisation of the motor regions of the brain. And again, what that means is we need to be able to modify the brain structure, and we can do that with exercise and activation of muscle. So is back muscle dysfunction relevant for spinal health? Well, there is now convincing evidence from systematic reviews that exercise interventions that include activation of the multifidus muscle are effective. The evidence so far suggests that we don't know whether it's more effective than other exercise programs, but the problem is that all of the big studies that have an impact on those analyses are studies where the same exercise has been done with every single person. So there's no individualisation and selection of patients, which I think is really important. So does back muscle dysfunction have implications for injury, recovery, rehabilitation? Well, what I think we need to understand is that exercise does have the capacity to prevent and restore some of the changes in muscle structure. It does have the opportunity to change the way that muscles are being recruited in function, overcoming inhibition, changing the activation patterns, and we've shown that we can reduce the muscle inflammatory response and the impact that that has on muscle structure. We've certainly seen that general exercise is beneficial, but its effects are not complete, and maybe we can have more impressive response on the health of the muscle if we're able to directly activate it. So that's what we do with exercise, and maybe stimulation is another possibility to achieve that.